Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast, brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks with Madeleine Croucher of Ogilvy about the book Change for the Better and the research done to understand how charities can increase engagement and support from contributors by using behavioral science.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell, and thanks for listening to Understanding Consumer Neuroscience. Today, my guest is Madeleine Croucher, who is with Ogilvy. And Madeleine, how do you introduce yourself? What do you do on a day-to-day basis?
It's a very good question, and it's always a tricky one to answer. My official title is Consulting Director at Ogilvy's Behavioural Science Practice, like you said. And essentially what we do is creatively apply insights from behavioural science to develop, test solutions for a whole range of different challenges and a whole range of different clients, really. So it could be everything from how do we encourage people to kind of choose one brand over another brand in a supermarket?
Right.
Could be how can we encourage the general public to recycle in the correct way? Or it could be looking at how we drive consumption frequency of nutritious products in emerging markets. So it really is, it's hard to explain because it really is so varied. But I guess the core component is that it's always influencing human decision-making, human behavior in whatever context that occurs.
And certainly this whole series has been about how people are complicated, and just telling them this is a good thing for you to do or telling them about a product is not enough. It's not effective to actually alter behavior. There is a science behind altering behavior.
Yeah, and I'd say humans are definitely very complex, but they're also highly predictable, which we can use to our advantage. So yeah, lots of complex things to unpick. And definitely when you get beneath that surface layer of what we think we know about people based on what they tell us,
right,
we start to uncover lots of interesting things. But those interesting things are largely predictable, which means we can design these solutions in a way that we have a good inkling on whether they're going to be effective or not. And
you've done a book on behavioral science for good?
Yeah, so November last year, a book called Change for Better, which looks at the applications of behavioral science to drive supporter engagement and fundraising. So very much focused on those kind of pro-social uses of behavioral science in that kind of charity context.
It does seem that charities have gotten, I say, smarter in the past few years, that their approaches to talking about what they do and how they help people and so forth do seem to be more polished, like just the way that they communicate.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the main drivers for me and my co-editors wanting to publish this book, is that we actually found that at lots of conferences where charities were speaking, there was loads of brilliant thinking, loads of great ideas, but it wasn't necessarily visible to kind of a wider audience, but they were doing lots of interesting things and testing a surprising amount. And that's what really drove us to publish this book, is actually bringing all of those great examples of this brilliant thinking that charities are doing to the forefront and sharing those learnings, both in that sector, but actually there's lots of learnings for broader sectors as well.
In your research, did you find that there are very particular ways that charities can engage with folks to get them to participate, to contribute?
Yeah, so actually in the book, we looked at 17 different case studies, done by, I think it was about 24 different practitioners all around the world. What we wanted to do was look at the different strategies that lots of those people were using and kind of consolidate it into a framework so that we could actually help people like really practically apply those insights. And we actually found there were 5 key strategies that charities were using to various degrees of success. So it kind of builds this acronym called RAISE, very fitting for fundraising. So it's all about making it relevant, making it appealing, making it intuitive, social, and easy. So those were the 5 kind of lofty insights that came to the forefront. And within each of those, there are different kind of strategies you can pull on. So when we think about making it really relevant for the audience, we're thinking about really how can we frame an appeal or a campaign to make it really strongly resonate with people on a personal level?
Right.
Can we tap into their personal experience? Making it appealing, can we tap into kind of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards? making it intuitive. We're thinking about all those emotional drivers, all those system one things that influence our behavior kind of beyond our conscious awareness. Making it social, thinking about how the people around us influence our decisions. And then making it easy is always the simplest one, but always the one that people overlook the most. So we thought we've got to throw easy in there because people often forget it, even though it's the most important.
Sure. That just making it simple to make a donation, fewest steps possible. Like we think about that all the time in all kinds of e-commerce infrastructure, but there's a lot of assumption there. It sounds like something that takes a few tries to make it something that appeals to people, that it actually resonates with individuals. Like what kind of, how do you prove that you're doing that well?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with that when you talk about making assumptions. I think there's a few layers to that. I think lots of companies, whether it's charities or the private sector, kind of can suffer from what's known as the curse of knowledge. Where actually we have so much information about our organization or our cause or our initiative that we almost find it difficult to put ourselves in our audience's shoes and see things from their perspective. So we tend to talk about things assuming they have lots of knowledge that they might not.
Right.
So I think that's one of the assumptions. I think another of the assumptions is that actually, if we talk to our audience to find out what's meaningful to them and what's going to motivate them, actually, it can be very difficult for people to articulate that.
Yeah.
People don't always know what they're feeling. They can't always articulate that. And they don't even always say what they're actually thinking. We know there's a big kind of intention action gap where people can say, oh, yes, I'll definitely do this thing, but it most of the case doesn't translate into action. So there's lots of interesting things to unpick there, so we don't fall into that trap. Well,
and it's certainly been an ongoing conversation in this whole series about when you ask people what they think, they will always say something.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily give you anything useful, but that's where this sort of implicit testing and other neuroscience strategies come in to actually watch their real behavior. I mean, I would think with charity, the main metric is, did they donate or did they, click on the link or any of those participatory elements? But it's really, you get into how am I going to optimize this? Like, what are the kinds of tests I can do to say for this given group of people, how will I get the most to contribute?
Yeah. So it's really, like you said, really about understanding what's truly going to motivate that audience. So not resting on our own assumptions, but also not necessarily resting on what they tell us. So as we know from things like System 1, System 2, there's some really interesting examples. I think there's a large scale study in the US that actually says, I think it was like 80% of potential donors said that the performance of a charity was one of the main reasons why they would donate.
Sure.
They said that was really important to them. But actually, only about 10% of people actually donated based on that factor. And it was actually things like, whether their social circles donated to that or supported that charity, how easy it was to engage with them, whether they got some kind of emotional connection. So I think surfacing those other kind of System 1 reasons really helps us then design better solutions.
Yeah, I immediately am hit on, if you ask for a rational answer to something, you're going to get a rational answer, whether it's true or not. Because it strikes me that this is a very emotional decision to support a charity. And it seems to me the social construct around my friends are supporting this as well is incredibly important. I look at all of the I am riding bikes for cancer kind of things. And, will you support me as I do my ride? Like a certain dollar amount per kilometer, that kind of thing. That you get that social engagement within your own social group. You're essentially encouraging the donator to use behavioral science approaches to get their friends to participate as well.
Yeah, it has kind of a knock-on effect. And we see that with some of those big initiatives, like, I don't know if you remember, the ice bucket challenge. It's like a viral campaign. Took a chunk of ice to the head for the effort, right? That was ALS, as I recall. Yeah. So those forces can be really powerful in getting people to support, along with many others. And it's all about finding that thing that's going to work for your specific charity or your specific context, because it does vary. Yeah. Yeah, each of those has different challenges in it as well.
But it's got to be tough to make something relevant that isn't happening to an individual. Typically, our donators in a very different location than the folks that need the support. So how you make that relevant seems very challenging.
Yeah, I'd say that's one of the biggest challenges, well, one of many, but one of the biggest challenges charities face is kind of what we call closing that psychological distance.
Mm-hmm.
You might have a very big physical distance between you and the kind of place you're supporting. You might have kind of a large experiential gap between kind of your day-to-day and your environment and theirs. So how do you close that gap to make that issue feel really important and really relevant? And there's a few different tactics you can use there and a few different examples from the book that we've seen be really effective. One of my favorite examples is actually how we can use kind of communications to trigger empathy in our audience.
Right.
By triggering empathy, you kind of close that psychological gap. You bring them close to the cause. They resonate with it more, and then they're more likely to act. Two kind of interesting examples. One was looking at how can we actually encourage people to leave a gift in their will for a humanitarian cause. And what they did was in one lot of communication, it was kind of normal. In one set of communications, they said, they asked a question, which was, what would you do if you had to flee at a moment's notice? And got people to really self-reflect on what they would do in that kind of situation if they were forced to be a refugee, essentially. Right. And they actually found, I'm trying to remember the stats, but they actually found that by just including that question that triggered empathy, it boosts donations by some crazy amount, which I can't remember. I think it was like at least over 20%. And so there's some really interesting ways that you can close that gap. And it works beyond words as well. There was a really nice example, I think it was out of Germany, for a blindness charity. And in some direct mail, what they did is in half the condition, they sent them the normal letter asking for donations. And in the other half, they actually blurred out the middle of the letter so that you could only see what was around the periphery and you couldn't get the full picture or the full information. And the idea behind this was actually to simulate the experience of the beneficiaries, actually simulate what it's like to have partial blindness,
right.
Something that lots of the audience couldn't resonate with. And again, they saw significant increases in people donating because they'd managed to trigger that empathy and bring people close to the cause.
It's such a good idea. With a blurred piece of documentation, you put a typically sighted person in the experience of an impaired sighted person.
Yeah, it's a really lovely, creative way of closing that gap. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got to stimulate empathy. But always the question, how would you protect your family? What would you do in case of? Like, those are all good empathy kinds of approaches. But the images have got to be powerful too. And I think back, as a child of the 80s, to the famine in Africa, and there's an iconic photograph of a child who's struggling to get to a refugee center and is fallen, and there was a vulture in the background, as I recall, and it was just like one of these insanely impactful images of this is what famine looks like.
It's just very visceral. It gets that visceral reaction where you really then start to appreciate and identify with that situation. And you're right, that's why images are so powerful, because it really sucks you in. It's really concrete, and it leaves like this lasting imprint on your brain, which affects your kind of future perceptions. So yeah, really powerful.
But do you still have to tie that empathic moment into the action of contributing?
It's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
I think, in the example I shared of the blindness charity, it's more getting you to appreciate and understand the experience of the beneficiary. So it's not kind of, I guess you could argue it's directly tied to the ask, but it's more about bringing people closer to that cause.
Right.
Yeah, I think it can be a little bit detached from the actual ask, but it's more about bringing people into that world so they can empathize with the beneficiary. That's when we kind of see it to be more impactful.
Well, and I hope that it's not just about I'm raising more money, that it is making people more aware of the problem and maybe changing other behaviors. Like, we're very focused on charities in this conversation, but you opened with this, change for the better is also reducing waste, reducing impact on environment. Like, all of these are changes for the better as well, that I think governments, in representing the people, are saying we as people should do more of this. And those are very vague. And very, it's hard to put concrete examples around all of that, like recycling.
Yeah, and when you talk about kind of those sustainability actions like recycling, it's kind of the same set of psychological factors at play. Again, it's that psychological distance, especially with things like climate change, sustainability. It's that temporal element. The impacts of climate change feel so far in the future,
right,
even though they're actually approaching quite fast. But my day-to-day action of not recycling something properly or wasting food, I don't feel or see the effects of that until the long term.
Yeah.
So it's about closing that gap and making those impacts feel a lot more present so that we can create that urgency to drive the action. So that's a particular challenge with kind of sustainability behaviors and climate changes, making the impacts feel more immediate so we can drive that urgency.
Yeah, because in some ways you scratch that empathic itch by being able to click on the donate now and say, now I've done some good, as opposed to sorting your cardboard and taking it to the curb. They're harder to match up.
Yeah, you're right, because that donating feels
it's immediate.
Very immediate. Although it presents an interesting question for things like leaving gifts in wills, because when you leave a legacy, again, you might be putting it in your will now, and then the charity might not see the benefit for, 30, 40, however many years. Yeah. So actually, it's an interesting parallel there between how can you make people feel like they're having an impact today by putting it in their will, even though, tangibly that benefit isn't seen till later. So yeah, it's an interesting parallel there.
Well, it's an interesting question for a charity to think in those long-term aspects, to say, that we will, this benefit will be worthwhile for the organization X many decades later. Like that, it speaks to the charity as well. I mean, I think we provided a bunch of concrete examples here. The question is, how did they get to those examples, or how did they learn these would be the right ways to go about things? Like, how do you validate an approach without just trying it and then measuring the results after the fact? Are there strategies for testing earlier in the cycle?
Do you mean kind of testing the impact of ideas and then like iterating on them in that kind of way?
Yeah, and I'm thinking in the same way that we test a bunch of brand examples to say which ones of these versions of brand is most impactful for our audience. We've come up with a lot of different strategies here for how we would help a charity succeed. How do you pick one to spend the charity's money on to actually raise more funds?
Yeah, I guess there's kind of 2 points in the cycle where we do some testing. We primarily focus on the kind of testing upfront to really understand the audience and understand what's motivating them. So like we were saying, kind of go beyond that surface level insight and actually kind of get under the skin. We then use that insight to test, develop the solutions. And then when it comes to validating those, like actually showing like out of these 6 options, which one's most impactful, I'd say this is where there's probably the biggest opportunity to do more testing in this space. I think especially in the charity sector, obviously kind of budgets vary. So the scale of testing varies quite a lot. But I think there's value we can pull from lots of different types of testing, whether that's kind of large scale RCTs, whether it's smaller qualitative work, whether it's more kind of implicit reactions to different stimulus. I think there's kind of a scale of things. And in the charity sector, it does vary on what works. And we've definitely explored lots of different types along the way.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder how someone picks a given charity to support. There is a zero-sum game here. You only have so much time and resources to contribute to a cause, and there are a lot of causes. So it is interesting to say, how does someone fall on a particular cause?
Yeah, and this is where I think it's really interesting, this kind of tension between altruism and ego. Lots of people think they donate to a specific cause because they're doing the right thing. They see kind of this is an important cause. Donating is a good thing to do. But actually, as much as we hate to admit it, or as much as we can't even recognize it in ourselves, we are largely driven by our egos, even in this space. And we'll donate to something because it makes us feel good about ourselves, because we look good to others. Like we said, because it's even easier. So I think there's kind of a spectrum of reasons people choose one charity over another. In a lot of cases, it might be because they have a really strong emotional connection to that cause.
Right.
Maybe they've had some previous experience that links to that cause. That's a reason to donate. Another, like the Ice Bucket Challenge example, is because it's kind of a social phenomenon and they're kind of going along with it.
Well, and I wonder how many people, if you ask them, did you do the Ice Bucket Challenge? Yes. What was the charity?
And I think they actually found that afterwards in some kind of analysis, was that actually loads of people took part and they didn't even realize what they were donating towards. And it raises an interesting question of, does that matter?
No.
If actually the end result was lots of donations, does it matter that people didn't know what they were donating towards? It poses an interesting question. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And again, did lots of folks donate in that process as well? Because it was a viral challenge. You were basically doing it and calling out the folks you wanted to participate next. Whether or not they actually made a donation was a separate issue. But,
that's true. True. It's got to follow on to the kind of actual action we're after, which is the supporting.
Yeah. And ALS is a serious disease. I mean, I remember this. That's what this was about. It didn't have anything to do with dumping ice over your head, though.
No, it was very detached. Yeah.
I don't know how those two things associate at all. I know that someone suffering from ALS would have a tough time doing that, but that doesn't necessarily correlate at all. So, I mean, there's a downside to virality too, that it does create something that can disconnect from the overall mission. And
one of the real values in supporter engagement is that long-term support of the charity.
Right.
Like you get a lot more value from regular donations than one-off. So yeah, in the same way, while those kind of viral situations can cause a big immediate uplift, you don't get those supporters for a long period of time, which decreases their value. So yeah, there's definitely pros and cons, and certainly a controversial one, that one.
Yeah, that is it is an unusual one, but just extremely memorable for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of us participated. Truly. It is interesting to me as a marketer, looking at the materials that come from charitable organizations around annual or routine contributions, not just one-time contributions. I don't know that it really makes a whole lot of difference to the audience. It seems like an interesting thing to test for, giving $10 a month versus giving $100.
Yeah, in terms of, it'd be interesting to test in terms of which one's more preferable for the audience.
Right. Well, and also, is there a psychological or a significant difference between the two? Like a transaction is a transaction. In some ways, setting up a recurring is no more effort than a one-time. It's just a question of, is there a perceived barrier there or not?
Yeah, it's interesting in that I think people feel obviously giving a regular donation is a bigger commitment, both kind of financially, but also psychologically, kind of knowing that you're kind of committing to this process over a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. But we see some interesting things with heuristics like the foot in the door effect, where actually if you get people to do a smaller ask first, they're much more likely to go on to do a bigger ask later.
Right.
And so sometimes it can be an interesting foot in the door to get people, in the door with that one-off donation and then convert them into a regular giver over time. That can sometimes be an effective way in.
The other side of this is actually very much like a sales side, the regular touches with these contributors to let them know how their money's being spent and to keep them engaged so that their monthly donation or their periodic donations are they feel like they're getting something from them. Like hearing from the charity seems to be an important part of the equation.
Yeah, and I think that's fundamentally because people want to know that their donation is actually having an impact.
Mm-hmm.
I think there can sometimes be a lot of mistrust with like how your money is being spent. Are there lots of overheads? How much is actually going directly to the beneficiaries? So there's lots of lovely ways in which charities can really communicate that impact to their donors to get their support long term, whether it's sending you photo updates of the donkey you've sponsored,
yes.
Or I think it's the Charity Water actually have this map that shows you, all of the water pumps that they've put up,
mm-hmm.
all across the world, and they show you videos and photos of them being built. They have case studies of people in the local communities. They make that really visual. So I think all of that really helps people kind of see how their money is being spent, and the positive impact it's having, like makes one of the biggest differences, I would say. Yeah.
And there's still that balance between, that's a very logical thing to say, is this an efficient charity where a significant portion of the funds gathered actually go directly into the particular efforts versus the overhead to operate the charity. But that's not an emotional thing at all. You know, it almost feels like for that logical thing to matter, there already has to be a reason that you're scrutinizing the charity in the first place. You're looking for a reason to disengage. They go, oh, they're not an efficient charity. Like, that seems too rational versus what we've otherwise explored has been an emotional response to why I want to support a charity.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it becomes more the case once you're kind of in the system, if you like.
Right.
I don't know if people like rationally think about that when they're making the decision to donate, but if they're already donating, they like their decision to be reinforced over time.
Routinely, yeah.
I guess it's kind of like a confirmation bias. You know, you want to know that you've made the right decision.
Yes.
So seeing all this impact you have kind of, again, makes you feel better about yourself.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. When it comes to actually making the decision to donate, we know that those logical things play less of a role. Like, actually, people say impact is important to them, but it doesn't fuel their decision to donate.
No, when you actually test that in an effective method in neuroscience approaches, you find out it doesn't influence the decision ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there was even a famous kind of quite old study that looked at overhead aversion. There was 2 conditions. In one condition, they said, you know, someone had put in seed money that covered all the charity's overheads. So any donation they gave would go 100% to the beneficiary. In another condition, they said that basically any donation they gave would be 1-to-1 matched.
Right.
So if I donated £100, someone else would also donate £100. Now, actually, that second option of 1-to-1 matching rationally, you know, actually generates way more income for the charity.
Right.
But I think it's like 80% of people were more likely to donate with the overhead approach, which isn't rational, but it makes us feel like we're having more impact because 100% of our donation is going to that beneficiary.
Yeah, that's very much a sort of behavioral science aspect of people like the sound of that, so they'll choose that. And it's in the charity's best option to select that, even though it's actually less money than the matching scenario.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is unfortunate, because the matching scenario is used a lot to use big contributors to say, okay, well, you know, if you make this big contribution, we'll use that with a matching scenario.
Yeah, and matching is very successful. I think it was just interesting in this, obviously quite simulated experiments where they were comparing one directly to another.
Right.
It was interesting to highlight the difference. But in isolation, matching has obviously very successful.
It's used a lot for a reason. It is a good strategy. It sounds like you want to combine the both. You know,
find some way of combining them both.
Some way to combine them both and say, don't worry, the overheads are covered by a certain class of donator. Your money's going to go directly to the cause.
Someone needs to test that.
Yeah, more testing. Absolutely. Maddie, so much fun to chat with you. Nudge Stock is coming up. I think we're going to publish this show right before Nudge Stock. Can you tell us a little bit about what Nudge Stock's all about?
Yeah, so Nudge Stock is on June 10th. So coming up very soon. It is global, more exciting than ever. It's actually our 10th year.
Congratulations.
And we have got a really exciting range of speakers lined up from all different fields, all different topics, everything from, you know, creating effective work cultures to solving for a divided world to how text messages can nudge vaccinations. I mean, we've got absolutely everything. So lots of interesting things. I definitely recommend you tune in. And
streamed all over the world. Anybody can watch. You'll learn something. If neuroscience and behavioral science matters to you, this is a place to get a lot of information in a very quick period of time.
We've also got a very fun segment this year called Networking in the Nudgeverse, which is a play on the metaverse. So definitely tune in just for that weird and wacky experience.
Madeleine Croucher, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Richard.
And we'll talk to you next time on Understanding Consumer Neuroscience.